You can be moving in the right direction and still feel more resistance than you expected. That is the part many people misread. They assume friction means they are failing, blocked, punished, or being told to turn around. But sometimes friction increases because you are trying to enter a new direction while still using an old version of yourself to get there. The path may not be wrong. The identity carrying you into it may be outdated. This is a different kind of pressure than ordinary difficulty. Ordinary difficulty comes from effort, learning, adjustment, or external demand. But evolutionary pressure comes from a mismatch between where your life is trying to move and who you are still trying to be while moving through it. You may be reaching toward a new level while still making decisions from an old fear. You may be asking for expansion while still negotiating with the beliefs that were built to keep you small. The friction is not only in the situation, it is in the split between direction and identity. That is why some seasons feel strangely heavy even when progress is happening. You may be doing more, seeing more, understanding more, and still feel like every step costs too much. This does not always mean the work is wrong. It may mean the work is exposing the parts of you that cannot travel forward unchanged. A new life does not only ask for new actions, it asks for a new relationship with action itself. If the old self tries to carry the new path, every movement feels heavier than it should. You can notice this in very simple ways. You may set a goal, make a plan, and genuinely want the result. But when it is time to move, something tightens. You are not resisting the goal as much as you are resisting the version of yourself you believe you have to become in order to reach it. Maybe you think you have to be perfect. Maybe you think you have to be seen. Maybe you think you have to disappoint people, lose approval, or stop explaining yourself. The resistance is not always against growth. Sometimes it is against the identity cost you have attached to growth. This is where friction becomes useful, because it shows you the hidden terms of your own expansion. It reveals what you believe moving forward will require from you. If you believe progress requires self-abandonment, your system will hesitate. If you believe visibility requires danger, your system will contract. If you believe success requires becoming someone cold, false, or unrecognizable, part of you will refuse to participate. The pressure is not random. It is pointing toward the beliefs that have been quietly defining what change means. Most people try to solve this by pushing harder, but pushing harder can increase the contradiction. If the friction is caused by an identity mismatch, more force only makes the mismatch louder. You can pressure yourself into action for a while, but the deeper resistance will not disappear just because you overpowered it. It will show up as exhaustion, resentment, inconsistency, or the strange feeling that you are moving forward without fully being inside your own movement. That is not sustainable. A path that requires constant self-conquest eventually turns growth into another form of punishment. The better question is not always, how do I make myself do this? Sometimes the better question is, what part of me thinks this movement is unsafe, false, or impossible? That question changes the entire atmosphere. It does not treat resistance as an enemy. It treats resistance as information. It asks you to listen beneath the surface delay and find the inner agreement that is not yet updated. Often, the part of you resisting change is not trying to sabotage you. It is trying to protect an old version of safety. That old safety may have served you at one time. It may have taught you how to survive, belong, avoid harm, stay accepted, or remain functional in environments where full honesty did not feel possible. But what protects you in one season can restrict you in another. The same pattern that once helped you endure can later become the ceiling you keep hitting. This is why growth sometimes feels like betrayal before it feels like freedom. You are not only stepping into something new, you are loosening loyalty to the strategies that once kept you intact. This creates a very specific kind of inner conflict. One part of you wants the next level, but another part still respects the rules of the old one. One part knows it is time to move, while another part keeps checking whether movement will cause too much belonging. One part is ready to expand, while another part still believes expansion must be earned through strain. So the pressure builds, not because life is punishing you, but because two internal systems are trying to direct the same body. Until you see that clearly, you may keep calling the conflict confusion. This is why things often get loud, chaotic, or uncomfortable right before a shift. The old identity does not always release authority quietly. It has routines, explanations, emotional habits, and familiar reactions that have been practiced for years. When a new direction starts pulling you forward, those old structures can flare up. You may suddenly doubt yourself more. You may feel unusually tired. You may become more sensitive to criticism or more aware of how much approval still affects you. These reactions are not proof that you should stop. They are proof that the old pattern knows it is being challenged. There is a difference between a warning and a purge. A warning tells you that something is truly misaligned, unsafe, or dishonest. A purge brings old material to the surface because it can no longer remain hidden inside the next version of your life. The problem is that both can feel uncomfortable. This is why discernment matters. You do not want to romanticize every struggle as growth, but you also do not want to run from every discomfort as if discomfort itself means danger. The question is not simply, does this feel hard? The question is, does this hardness come from violation or from expansion pressing against an old boundary? That distinction can change how you interpret the season you are in. If the pressure is asking you to abandon your truth, it deserves attention and possibly refusal. But if the pressure is asking you to abandon an old limitation, it may feel intense without being wrong. You may feel fear because you are about to become more visible. You may feel tension because you are about to stop performing a smaller identity. You may feel chaos because the structure that once organized your life is losing control. Not all discomfort is misalignment. Some discomfort is the nervous system learning that the old limits are no longer law. Still, this does not mean you should rush. Evolutionary pressure becomes dangerous when people confuse intensity with permission to act recklessly. A frequency jump does not require you to destroy everything in one emotional moment. It asks you to become more honest about what can no longer be carried forward. That honesty may lead to action, but action should come after recognition, not before it. When you move too quickly just to escape pressure, you may end up obeying the same old pattern in a more dramatic form. This is why patience has a different meaning here. Patience does not mean staying asleep inside the old life. It means allowing the new self to become strong enough to move without panic. It means letting clarity mature past reaction. It means giving your system time to separate true direction from emotional urgency. Many people think patience means delay, but real patience can be an active form of alignment. It prevents you from building your future out of the pressure you were supposed to understand. You may notice that the pressure begins to teach you where your energy is still leaking. It shows you where you are trying to be ready before you are honest. It shows you where you are trying to perform confidence instead of building trust. It shows you where you still ask old fears for permission to enter new rooms. These are not small discoveries. They reveal the mechanics behind the friction. The resistance is not just in the outside world. It is in every place where your movement forward still has to pass through an outdated agreement about who you are allowed to be. Once you see this, the goal becomes less about forcing a breakthrough and more about reducing contradiction. You begin asking what would make the next step more internally true. You begin noticing which choices expand you and which choices only inflate the old identity with new language. You begin seeing that growth is not always a leap into something bigger. Sometimes it is the quiet refusal to keep dragging an inspired self into every new opportunity. This pressure begins to reorganize you from the inside, not by giving you immediate comfort, but by showing you exactly where the old structure can no longer support the new direction. And that is where the friction starts becoming readable. It is no longer just chaos, resistance, or discomfort. It becomes a message written through your own reactions, your own hesitation, your own repeated exhaustion. It begins showing you the difference between effort that strengthens you and effort that fractures you. It begins showing you the difference between fear that protects your integrity and fear that protects your limitation. You may still feel the pressure, but now it has a shape. And once pressure has shape, you can begin to listen to what it is asking you to release before you try to force yourself through the next door. The next layer is learning that pressure does not always mean acceleration. Sometimes pressure means something in the system is asking for a cleaner arrangement before more movement becomes possible. If you keep interpreting pressure as a command to go faster, you may miss the way it is showing you where force has replaced alignment. This is one of the easiest mistakes to make during a season of change. You feel the intensity rising, so you assume life is demanding immediate action, when often it is demanding a more honest relationship with the action you are already taking. That honesty begins with noticing where your movement still depends on an old image of yourself. You may say you want growth, but secretly imagine growth as proving yourself to people who once misunderstood you. You may say you want freedom, but still picture freedom as finally becoming impressive enough to feel safe. You may say you want peace, but keep trying to create it through control, explanation, or over preparation. These are not small contradictions. They show that the new direction is being filtered through the same identity that created much of the pressure in the first place. This is why some progress feels like grinding instead of opening. The movement is real, but the motive is still tangled. You are doing the right looking thing from the wrong internal position. That creates a kind of friction that effort alone cannot dissolve. You can work harder, organize better, speak more clearly, or make another plan, but if the inner posture remains unchanged, the same pressure follows you into the next step. The problem is not the step itself. The problem is the self-concept that keeps trying to take the step while still obeying yesterday's rules. You can see this in the way people chase a new life while carrying the old measurement system with them. They want to be free, but still measure freedom by approval. They want to be authentic, but still measure authenticity by whether it is accepted quickly. They want to become more aligned, but still punish themselves whenever alignment moves slower than performance. This is how the old identity survives inside new language. It allows the vocabulary to change while keeping the operating system almost untouched. Evolutionary pressure exposes that gap. It shows you where the words and the inner mechanics do not match yet. You may speak about trust while still making decisions from fear. You may speak about surrender while secretly trying to manage every outcome. You may speak about becoming new while still demanding that the new self protect every comfort of the old self. None of this means you are fake. It means transformation often begins before the deeper operating system has fully caught up. That is why the friction can feel personal. It seems like life is against you, but often it is simply refusing to let the old structure carry the new weight. A bridge built for one level of traffic cannot safely hold another level forever. At first, the strain may appear as inconvenience. Then it becomes fatigue. Then it becomes repeated breakdown, delay, emotional heaviness, or confusion. These are signals that the structure underneath the movement needs attention, not because you are broken, but because you are trying to move more life through a form that was built for less truth. There is a quiet mercy in that resistance, even when it feels inconvenient. If every outdated identity could carry you into the next stage without protest, you might never notice what needed to change. You would simply drag the same fears, habits, and distortions into larger opportunities. Then the opportunity would become bigger, but the internal conflict will become bigger too. Friction interrupts that. It slows the movement enough for the hidden pattern to become visible before it becomes amplified. This is where patience becomes practical, not passive. You are not waiting because you are afraid. You are waiting long enough to understand what the pressure is revealing. There is a difference between avoidance and observation. Avoidance refuses to look. Observation looks without immediately forcing an answer. In this phase, observation can save you from repeating a pattern with more intensity simply because you were too eager to call movement progress. You may notice that the pressure often gathers around the same places. It may gather around speaking honestly. It may gather around being seen. It may gather around choosing something without full approval. It may gather around finishing, starting, resting, charging money, setting boundaries, or letting something be imperfect. These repeated pressure points are not random. They reveal where the old identity still has authority. Wherever pressure keeps returning, there is usually a belief still deciding what you are allowed to do. Once you notice that, the question becomes more precise. You are no longer asking, why is everything so hard? You are asking, what rule am I still obeying that makes this harder than it has to be? That one shift can open a different level of understanding. The friction may not be telling you to quit. It may be showing you the invisible rule that makes continuing feel impossible. It may not be telling you that you are unready. It may be showing you the outdated condition you placed on readiness. For example, someone may feel intense friction before sharing their work, not because the work is wrong, but because they still believe visibility requires perfection. Someone may feel pressure before changing a relationship, not because the change is false, but because they still believe love means endless accommodation. Someone may feel resistance around rest, not because rest is unsafe, but because they still believe worth has to be proven through exhaustion. In each case, the pressure is not only emotional, it is instructional. It points to the agreement that must be seen before the next movement can become clean. This is why forcing the outer action without addressing the inner agreement can create temporary success and long-term strain. You may push through and accomplish the thing, but if the old rule remains untouched, the next step produces the same battle again. That is how people become successful and still feel trapped. They have moved forward externally while remaining governed internally by the same fear. The room changed, but the inner authority did not. The scenery changed, but the pressure pattern stayed alive. A cleaner form of growth asks you to change the authority beneath the action. It asks you to see where fear has been allowed to define responsibility, where shame has been allowed to define discipline, where approval has been allowed to define safety. When those definitions begin to loosen, movement changes texture. You may still feel nervous, but not divided in the same way. You may still need effort, but the effort does not feel like self-violence. You may still face uncertainty, but uncertainty no longer feels like proof that you are wrong. That is when friction begins to transform. It stops being only a wall and becomes diagnostic. It shows you what still needs updating inside the self that is trying to move. This does not remove all discomfort, but it removes some of the confusion around discomfort. You begin to understand that not every difficult feeling deserves obedience. Some feelings are old alarms ringing in a new room. Some fears are echoes of conditions that no longer govern your life. Some resistance is not wisdom. It is memory asking to be reinterpreted. But this requires care, because you cannot bully an old identity into releasing control. That only creates another layer of pressure. The old self formed for reasons. It carried you through seasons where other strategies were not available. If you treat it like an enemy, you create inner conflict where integration is needed. A wiser approach is to recognize its function, thank it without romanticizing it, and stop letting it make every future decision. Respect does not mean surrendering authority. It means understanding why a pattern formed before deciding whether it still belongs. This is where the pressure before ascension becomes less mysterious and more precise. It is not just chaos before a breakthrough. It is the moment when outdated inner leadership can no longer guide the next phase without creating strain. Life begins asking for a transfer of authority, not from one extreme to another, not from fear into recklessness, but from inherited protection into conscious participation. You begin to move less from reflex and more from recognition. You begin to understand that the next level is not only a place you enter, it is a way of being that must become honest enough to hold what you are asking for. And once that becomes clear, even the discomfort starts carrying different information. The pressure does not disappear immediately, but it becomes less blind. You can feel where it gathers. You can hear what it is questioning. You can notice which fears repeat and which truths keep returning quietly beneath them. This is how the next movement begins to form. Not as dramatic escape from friction, but as a gradual reorganization around a self that no longer needs the same old rules to feel real. The deeper movement begins when you stop treating friction as proof that something has gone wrong and start reading it as evidence that something is being asked to update. This does not mean every obstacle is meaningful in the same way, and it does not mean every hard thing should be endured. It means the pressure deserves to be examined before it is obeyed or rejected. Some pressure points to a door that should not be entered. Some pressure points to a part of you that cannot enter the next door unchanged. The difference is subtle, but it matters. When pressure is warning you away from something false, it often carries a sense of contraction around your truth. You feel yourself shrinking, performing, denying, or becoming less honest in order to continue. But when pressure is revealing an outdated identity, it often carries a different quality. You may feel afraid, exposed, uncertain, or stretched. But beneath that discomfort, there is still a quiet recognition that something in you is being invited forward. The fear is loud, but the direction is not empty. This is why discernment becomes more important than speed. A person can rush away from pressure and call it wisdom, just as easily as they can rush toward pressure and call it courage. Both can be avoidance if neither one is rooted in honest seeing. The question is not whether the pressure is comfortable. It rarely is. The question is whether the pressure is asking you to betray yourself or asking you to stop betraying yourself in a more subtle way. That distinction is where many people either repeat the old cycle or begin to move differently. You may notice that the old identity often tries to interpret pressure through familiar language. It says, "This is too much." It says, "You are not ready." It says, "You should wait until there is no fear." But sometimes what it really means is, "I do not know how to remain in control if you continue." That is not the same message. Fear often disguises itself as practical wisdom, because practical wisdom is easier to trust. This is why you have to listen beneath the first explanation and ask what the fear is protecting. Sometimes fear is protecting your actual well-being. Sometimes it is protecting an old self-image. Sometimes it is protecting the comfort of being underestimated. Sometimes it is protecting a familiar limitation that has become part of how you recognize yourself. That is why the pressure before expansion can feel almost offensive. It does not only challenge what you do, it challenges the identity that has been quietly benefiting from not changing. Even painful identities can become familiar enough to feel like home. This is where the friction becomes intimate. It begins showing you not only where life is demanding more, but where you have become loyal to less. You may have learned to be loyal to struggle because struggle made your effort feel valid. You may have learned to be loyal to delay because delay protected you from being judged. You may have learned to be loyal to confusion because confusion kept you from having to choose. These loyalties are rarely conscious. They live in the body as hesitation, heaviness, overthinking, or sudden tiredness whenever the next step becomes real. Once those loyalties are seen, the pressure changes shape. It stops being a vague heaviness and becomes a map of where your energy is still tied to an old agreement. You begin to see that some of your resistance is not against the future. It is grief for the identity that will not be able to come with you in the same form. A person can want growth and still mourn the version of themselves that knew how to survive the old world. That grief deserves respect, because it explains why expansion can feel like loss before it feels like liberation. But respect does not mean surrendering the future to the past. You can honor the version of you that survived without letting that version define what is possible now. This is one of the cleanest forms of inner maturity. You stop mocking the old self for being afraid, but you also stop letting fear hold the authority seat. You understand why the pattern formed, but you do not continue worshiping it just because it has history. The old identity may deserve compassion, but it does not automatically deserve leadership. When leadership begins to transfer, life often gets quieter in one way and clearer in another. The pressure may still be there, but you are no longer interpreting it only as opposition. You start asking better questions. Not how do I escape this feeling, but what is this feeling showing me about the way I am trying to move? Not how do I become fearless, but what fear is still being allowed to define the terms of my growth? Not why is this so hard, but what part of this hardness belongs to the path and what part belongs to the identity I am bringing to it. That kind of questioning slows the old reflex without stopping the evolution. It gives you space to respond instead of simply reacting to pressure. This is important because many people make their biggest mistakes when they are trying to end discomfort too quickly. They quit too soon, commit too fast, explain too much, force an outcome, or build a plan from panic and call it clarity. But pressure does not always need immediate resolution. Sometimes it needs to be listened to until the hidden rule becomes visible. The hidden rule is often the real source of the friction. It may be the rule that you cannot be seen unless you are perfect. It may be the rule that you cannot disappoint anyone and still be good. It may be the rule that rest must be earned through exhaustion. It may be the rule that growth is only real if it hurts. These rules can run underneath your life for years without being named. Then expansion comes close, and suddenly the rule starts creating noise because the next movement violates it. When that happens, the noise can feel like a sign to stop. But often, it is the sound of an old rule losing its unquestioned authority. That does not mean you ignore the fear. It means you do not make fear the final interpreter. You let it speak, but you also ask whether it is describing the present or replaying the past. You ask whether it is protecting your integrity or protecting your familiarity. You ask whether it is trying to keep you safe or trying to keep you recognizable to a version of life you have already outgrown. This is the place where effort becomes more refined. Instead of trying to force yourself through resistance, you begin removing the unnecessary resistance created by outdated agreements. The step may still require discipline. The path may still ask for courage, but it no longer has to be made heavier by beliefs that no longer match who you are becoming. You stop adding extra suffering to the movement just to prove it is serious. You stop treating strain as the only evidence that transformation is real. That is a major shift. Many people do not know how to trust growth unless it feels like pressure, because pressure has been mistaken for importance. If something feels difficult, they assume it must be meaningful. If something feels lighter, they suspect it must be shallow. But not every true thing arrives with violence. Not every serious moment requires collapse. Sometimes the next level becomes possible not because you finally force yourself harder, but because you stop dragging unnecessary conflict into the act of moving. This does not make the process passive. It actually makes it more exact. You are no longer scattering energy into self-attack, panic, over-explanation, or proving. You are using attention to separate real challenge from inherited resistance. You are learning which discomfort strengthens you and which discomfort only repeats an old wound. You are learning to move without turning every step into a trial of worthiness. That kind of movement may look quieter from the outside, but internally it is more advanced because it does not depend on constant inner war. And this is where the pressure before ascension begins to reveal its deeper purpose. It is not simply there to make life harder before something better arrives. It is there to show whether the structure carrying you can hold the next measure of truth. If it cannot, the friction will keep speaking through delay, exhaustion, contradiction, and repeated emotional resistance. Not because you are being denied the next stage, but because the next stage cannot be entered cleanly while the old authority is still defining the terms. The pressure is not blocking the doorway. It is showing you what cannot pass through it unchanged. Eventually, you begin to understand that the shift is not only about reaching something higher. It is about becoming less divided as you reach. It is about moving without needing the old fear to approve the movement. It is about allowing growth to be guided by recognition rather than self-punishment. This is why the friction can soften even before the outer situation fully changes. Once you understand what it has been pointing toward, the pressure no longer has to scream to get your attention. It can become a quieter signal, a more precise sensation, a place where your next honesty begins to gather. And when that honesty gathers, the next step may not look dramatic at first. It may look like one cleaner decision, one refusal to obey an old rule, one moment where you choose not to make the path heavier than it needs to be, one breath where you notice the pressure and do not immediately turn it into fear. That is how the old identity begins losing its grip. Not always through one great breakthrough, but through repeated moments where you stop letting yesterday's survival strategies decide what tomorrow is allowed to become.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.